America's economy seems to be bouncing from one crisis to another. In March, massive bank failures and a federal bailout.
The really important headline is that the banking system is safe.
You're seeing the consequences of bad policy decisions.
This week, we hear from both parties in Congress trying to handle a roller coaster economy and falling consumer confidence.
It's hard to have confidence in the same people who've been very wrong about important things in the past.
One of the biggest battles in sports is over who should be allowed to compete.
There was an individual that was previously competing in the male category, was now going to be shifting over and competing in the female category. I ended up losing.
We take a look at some of the flashpoints in the debate.
Anyone who has a Y chromosome or has gone through male puberty, it ruins the integrity of sport to allow them to compete with women.
They're speaking from their transphobia.
We hear from athletes and look at the facts of where and who will be allowed to compete.
You wouldn't expect to see this many tourists in what was once the murder capital of the world.
Nervous for our safety.
The impression of it was that it's not a safe place to go.
We visit a place where a history of danger and drugs has become one hot fascination.
Welcome to Full Measure. I'm Sharyl Attkisson. America's bank regulators are working nonstop behind the scenes to avert a broad financial fiasco after a series of U.S. bank failures and more financial institutions said to be on the brink. It signals the worst crisis of its kind since the 1980s and may leave you asking how this could happen after so much money and effort have been spent over the last 100 years to avoid calamity. Today's cover story is fear itself. The first ingredient in the current recipe for banking disaster is America's record-shattering surge in inflation. Food prices up more than 11% in a year. Key items like eggs up 40%. Energy prices inflating a remarkable 41% last summer. Add to the mix the actions that America's money regulator, the Federal Reserve, took to counter the inflation, raising interest rates over 1,700% in a year. It's a toxic combination for many banks because of their investment choices. For views on exactly what's happening, we hear from two members of Congress on the House Financial Services Committee, Democrat Jim Himes.
The really important headline is that the banking system is safe.
And Republican Warren Davidson.
You're seeing the consequences of bad policy decisions.
We start with the March failure of California-based Silicon Valley Bank. Here's one of its seminars held online last fall.
At the most basic level, Silicon Valley Bank, we bank tech companies. But we also love to do so much more than that.
Because of Silicon Valley Bank's investment choices, rising inflation and interest rates created billions of dollars in paper losses. On March 9th, anxious customers withdrew $42 billion. $100 billion more was scheduled to go out the next day until regulators closed the door.
Silicon Valley Bank had some very unique features. It was largely venture capital money. It was a very kind of incestuous group of people that got talking together on the message boards and all decided to withdraw their money at once. That's called a classic bank run.
Anybody that watches the Christmas movie, It's a Wonderful Life, knows that, you know, the whole fundamental of the banking system is a lot of that money gets lent out. So if everybody comes and wants their money back all at once, it creates almost an impossible situation. Things stay stable as long as no one panics. But once everyone runs for the doors and says, I have to have my cash now, it really can be destabilizing to the banking system that we have.
And the crash of 1929 turned into the Great Depression.
More than 9,000 banks failed from 1930 to 1933. Americans rushed to withdraw their money, but about 1/5 of customer cash was lost forever.
Savers all panicked and rushed to get their savings out, often in vain.
The dynamic inspired one of the most famous lines in American history, spoken by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt at his 1933 inauguration.
The only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
That same year, Congress created the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. The FDIC insures up to $250,000 per depositor in member banks to lessen the odds of customer panic. But most of Silicon Valley Bank's deposits were way more than $250,000 and unprotected.
Now, Silicon Valley Bank had folks that deposited many, many millions of dollars, in some cases billions of dollars.
Same with New York-based Signature Bank, which was shut down 2 days later. And the newest closure, San Francisco's First Republic. And the promise of protection for deposits up to $250,000 was also unable to avert the savings and loan crisis from 1980 to 95, born of skyrocketing inflation and, again, the bank's investment choices. More than 2,900 banks failed, with assets of more than $2.2 trillion.
This crisis is a major economic and budgetary threat. It threatens the future of the housing finance system, and above all, it causes people to doubt the safety of financial institution deposits.
Next, from 2007 to 2014, a mortgage and financial crisis took out more than 500 banks with assets nearing $1 trillion. That included the largest bank failure in history, Washington Mutual. And Congress passed a $700 billion plan to bail out big banks at taxpayer expense.
Bear Stearns was forced to take an emergency loan funded by all of us.
President Bush tried to make light of a grim situation.
Seems like I showed up in a interesting moment.
If public confidence is key to avoiding panic and financial chaos, it doesn't help that today's regulators have proven shockingly wrong, says Davidson, the Republican. He and many others warned 3 years ago that mass government spending was causing a critical inflation problem.
Some people in the administration, some people in the Federal Reserve, some people in the Treasury said it wasn't. Well, they know that it was, and it did. And then they said, well, it won't hit consumers. Then it did hit consumers. And then they said, well, it's going to be transitory. And it clearly isn't transitory. So then when the Fed finally acknowledges it's not transitory, they start raising rates very rapidly.
The Fed, or Federal Reserve, is supposed to help avert fiscal crisis by managing interest rates, inflation, the money supply, and supervising banks. But the head of the Fed, Jerome Powell, and Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen wrongly insisted the inflation spike that started in 2021 was just temporary. A year later, Yellen admitted she was wrong.
Well, look, I think I was wrong then about the path that inflation would take.
It's hard to have confidence in the same people who've been very wrong about important things in the past.
Yeah, not just Secretary Yellen, but Chairman Powell and most of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors.
Both of our experts agree that record government spending is a driver of the troubling inflation, but they disagree on blame.
I would say yes. Coming out in order to make sure that people didn't starve to death, that businesses didn't go under, the federal government spent an enormous amount of money, $6 trillion over the course of the last 4 years. When the Republicans say that's a Democratic problem, baloney. 2/3 of that was spent under President Trump. If they try to make Democrats out to be the big spenders, the deficit under Donald Trump was absolutely record high deficits.
Today, experts warn that many U.S. banks have problematic investments similar to Silicon Valley Bank and won't be able to disentangle themselves overnight, leaving us with one sentiment from the bank runs of the 1930s. The biggest thing to fear might be fear itself.
So long as you don't have more than $250,000 on deposit at a bank, up to $250,000, your deposit is guaranteed. So if you're worried about your bank, you don't need to go withdraw those deposits.
The good news is for the vast majority of Americans, their deposits are safe. They have a $250,000 Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation coverage for, almost everyone in the country. They have less than $250,000 in their account or in any one account. Right. And so when you have deposits at banks, that insurance is the government saying, look, even if something bad happens and the bank fails, we will give you your money.
To put a lid on panic that could have spread to the whole country, the federal government stepped in and ensured deposits above $250,000 at the failed banks. Critics argue that bailed out rich businesses and encourages risky behavior by other banks. Ahead on Full Measure, states racing to position themselves in the controversy of boys playing on girls' teams. The debate over males playing on female sports teams as transgender athletes is growing louder and sometimes more confusing. Now many states are weighing in to propose or pass a rapid fire of laws on the topic. Lisa Fletcher has the latest.
The first exchange is underway.
Linnea Schultz in the red shorts and white jersey was a lightning bolt of a runner on her women's college track team.
I ran collegiate track for 4 years at Southern Utah University. I like to think that I was a good competitor. I broke 8 school records at my university, and I ended up leaving, I think, a pretty good legacy for myself.
For all of her accomplishments, Schultz still wrestles with a loss at a 2020 championship race. In the final leg of the relay, her teammates ran against a competitor the likes of which few in college sports had previously encountered. For 3 seasons, before facing Schultz and her teammates, Jonathan Eastwood ran for the University of Montana's men's team. By 2020, he had transitioned to June Eastwood and was running for the women's team.
What I experienced, that was an unfair situation. I ended up losing, and my team ended up losing to this individual.
There have been numerous cases where elite female athletes have lost to men who've transitioned to a female identity. In mixed martial arts, female fighter Erica Newsom on the right faced transgender fighter Fallon Fox on the left. Fox knocked out Newsom in less than 40 seconds. Fox later pushed back on any notion the fight was unfair in this CNN interview.
I say that it's completely fair. The medical community stands behind me in that there's no unfair competitive advantages.
A transgender weightlifter featured in this Vice News documentary, J.C. Cooper, who used to be Joel, was banned from competing against women. Cooper sued USA Powerlifting and recently won the right to compete. The organization plans to appeal. In high school athletics, a North Carolina school board canceled the remainder of its girls' volleyball games against another school after a biological male, now identifying as female, spiked the ball into a girl's face. That injured player, Peyton McNabb, spoke about the incident with North Carolina state lawmakers.
I suffered from a concussion and neck injury that to this day I'm still recovering from. Allowing biological males to compete against biological females is dangerous.
And in March, champion women's cyclist Hannah Ahrensman quit the sport after losing a race to transgender rider Tiffany Thomas. In a brief to the Supreme Court to show support for keeping women's athletics strictly for biologically born women, Ahrensman wrote, "I feel for young girls learning to compete who are growing up in a day when they no longer have a fair chance at being the new record holders and champions in cycling because men want to be in our divisions." States are taking up the issue on their own. 21 passed laws banning transgender girls from playing on girls' teams, including Kansas, where lawmakers overrode multiple vetoes and banned male students between kindergarten and college from playing girls' sports teams. And Wyoming, where students of the male sex are banned from competing on a team designated for students of the female sex. Meanwhile, a West Virginia law requiring sports team participation from middle school to college to be based on biological sex was put on hold by the Supreme Court last month without explanation. And with competing bills in the state House and Senate, North Carolina could soon become the latest state to ban males from playing on girls' sports teams between middle school and college.
They say there's an unfair advantage.
And people who say that, they're speaking from their transphobia, not from the facts.
As a trans athlete, Carly Webb, who now identifies as female, says she's lived the debate over people born male playing on women's teams.
And it's intercepted.
Webb, seen here running for a touchdown, is also a journalist with Outsports. She met with us after playing the season opener for Connecticut's all-women's tackle football team, the Reapers.
Touchdown, Reapers.
Is there a physical gap, though, between women and trans women in terms of just your strength and your ability?
You can't say that definitively because every body is different and every body is different. When you line up 20 people, for example, look at a team picture of the team I play for. There are many different body types across the spectrum.
The Biden administration has proposed new rules permitting transgender athletes to join school teams of their choice, with exceptions to ensure fairness and prevent injury. The exceptions displeasing transgender advocates. Former University of Kentucky swimming star Riley Gaines has been outspoken about protecting women's sports. Lately, she's been on a college speaking tour, partially propelled by her experience racing Leah Thomas, who competed on the men's swim team as William at the University of Pennsylvania the first 3 seasons of his college career, before joining the women's team in 2020 as Leah her senior year and shattered records.
I feel anyone who has gone through male puberty, which again proves my argument is not transphobic, because anyone who has a Y chromosome or has gone through male puberty, it ruins the integrity of sport to allow them to compete with women.
Though the students gathered for her speech at San Francisco State were generally peaceful, the situation outside was heated. Gaines says she was forced to barricade herself in a room before emerging into a hallway of protesters before police could escort her from campus.
Would having a separate category in athletics for transgendered women solve the problem?
I don't know if the answer to this would be having a separate category. I think that right now we need to look at how we're going to protect women and then figure out how we're going to create inclusive solutions for all.
So what is the Biden administration waiting on? They're just now letting this sit as far as their own proposal?
It seems to be. I mean, the Biden administration has all the power in this, right? And President Biden can push it through the Department of Education and have something in effect as early as kids going back to school this fall. That said, there's been a lot of pushback, and there are court cases which could splinter whatever he tries to do, meaning, some of it could go into effect and some of it could work its way through the courts.
And if schools don't comply with whatever it is that the president and the Department of Education wants to do, what happens?
They risk losing their federal funding.
All right. Thanks, Lisa. Appreciate it. When we return, find out what turned the former murder capital of the world into a hot tourist destination. Not all that long ago, Medellin Colombia was called the murder capital of the world and best known as the epicenter of the violent war on drugs. But there's been a stunning turnaround in one of the Western Hemisphere's most notorious cities. Scott Thuman takes us there to see how it happened.
When it comes to transformations, Medellin Colombia could hold the trophy. For decades, Medellin was the murder capital of the world, almost 19 killings a day at its worst, and its streets run by drug kings and gang leaders, most notably Pablo Escobar, once the 7th richest man in the world and the leader of its largest cocaine cartel, leaving a path of destruction and rich story for a hit show.
During the early 80s, the best smuggler in the world was Pablo Escobar.
These days, tourists line up to take photos at his gravesite, and the curiosity of a chaotic past enough to entice visitors like Lara Fuhrer and Blaine Tannenbaum from California.
You were saying that when you told people you were coming here, different reactions.
Our friends were all very excited and wanted to hear all the recommendations when we get back. And then our parents, who were young in the 80s, were
nervous for our safety, even though if they got on Google, they would realize it's a very safe place.
Yeah.
While Medellin still has its share of problems, drawing a crowd isn't one of them. Even in a barrio once largely considered a no-go zone for police years ago, Comuna 13 is now a haven for 12,000 tourists a week, snagging up Escobar t-shirts, cocktails, and taking in the view, often ignoring the bullet holes that still pockmark walls from a siege between soldiers and gangs, from a deadly battle to push out the pushers. For the city's leaders, the visitors, a welcome sight, even if part of the draw isn't ideal. Letys Lopez is the Undersecretary of Tourism.
Does it bother you that there are things like narco tourism where people come here specifically because they want to know about Pablo Escobar or because they watched Narcos?
We do recognize that it is our history, a history that cannot be erased. A history must be recognized in order to not repeat it.
Is it still difficult then to get rid of, to erase that reputation?
Yes, it has been a difficult process, but when people come, they really take that message that this is a transformed city, that it is a beautiful city.
And as tourists stop by to see Escobar's safe houses and the site of his death,
Around here, most of these attacks are going.
the city, expecting its best tourism year yet with 1.3 million visitors, is pushing its own narrative at this memorial park built on property Escobar once owned.
The allure here is a combination of curiosity, notoriety, and respect. The 46,000 bullet-like holes in this memorial represent each of the victims killed during Escobar's reign. To put that in perspective, it's more than 15 times the number of those killed in 9/11.
I think for us, it's to come here and to worship or idolize someone who's done so many terrible things is awful, but to understand how it shaped a place is important for anywhere you go, whether it's drug trade or, you know, the killing fields.
Similar to other terrible events in history, it's important to remember, recognize, so you don't repeat and see what happened, and have people be educated and remembering the victims and hearing their stories.
So while the legend of Escobar may drive the tourist curiosity, the true colors of the horror and history are on full display. For Full Measure, I'm Scott Thune in Medellin, Colombia.
And after a break, what's ahead next week on Full Measure? Coming up next week on Full Measure, many in the media claimed without evidence there was no reason to suspect any issues with the 2020 election. But when we examined the record that's been established since, we found a lot to raise eyebrows about.
And a lady walked up, had a ballot in her hand. Guillermo Fuentes received her ballot, opened it up, wrote on it, deciding who they're going to vote for, signed the name, and closed it.
A hard look at the real fallout after the 2020 election as we push into the 2024 presidential race. A Full Measure investigation next week. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Sharyl Attkisson.